The morning of February 20th, 1945, on Iwo Jima, a Marine Corps flamethrower team crept toward a Japanese pillbox carved into volcanic rock 300 yards from the black sand beaches. The concrete bunker had withstood 3 days of naval bombardment. Artillery shells had cratered the ground around it, but the fortification remained intact. The Marines knew what waited inside. Japanese soldiers, dug into position since the previous summer, their bunker connected by tunnels to dozens of similar positions across the island. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The flamethrower operator moved forward under covering fire, 75 yards from the target, 50 yards. Machine gun fire from the bunker's firing slit forced him down. He waited, then advanced again. At 30 yards, he triggered the weapon. A stream of jellied gasoline arced through the air, splashing against the concrete face and flowing through the narrow firing port. The Marines expected the familiar result from previous battles. A brief burst of flame, perhaps screaming from inside, maybe a few defenders stumbling out, uniforms burning. What happened instead changed warfare. The napalm didn't just burn on surfaces. It flowed like liquid fire into the bunker's interior, following the concrete corridors Japanese engineers had spent months constructing. Within seconds, the temperature inside the fortification surpassed 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The flames consumed oxygen faster than ventilation shafts could replenish it. Carbon monoxide concentrations spiked above 20%. The dozen soldiers inside had 3 choices, all fatal: suffocate from oxygen depletion, die from carbon monoxide poisoning, or burn. Most never made the choice. The superheated air itself killed them, cooking their lungs with each breath. The Marine flamethrower operator never saw the men inside die. He simply watched smoke pour from every opening in the concrete structure: firing slits, ventilation shafts, tunnel entrances 50 yards away. The bunker had become a crematorium. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Iwo Jima's 8 square miles, variations of this scene repeated hundreds of times daily. The weapon transforming Japanese defensive positions into death traps had emerged from a Harvard University laboratory just 3 years earlier. Its inventor, chemistry professor Louis Fiesser, had created napalm to solve a mundane military logistics problem. Natural rubber supplies had been cut off when Japan seized Southeast Asian plantations in 1942. The military needed a new thickening agent for incendiary weapons. Fiesser's team worked in the basement of Harvard's Converse Chemistry Laboratory throughout 1942. Their goal was simple: create a powder that, when mixed with gasoline, produced a stable gel that burned longer and hotter than existing incendiaries. On Valentine's Day, 1942, Fiesser reported success. His powder combined aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate. Mix it with gasoline, and you got a thick gel that clung to surfaces and burned at temperatures between 1400 and 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. The military tested it obsessively, not against factories or military installations, against houses. At Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, Army engineers constructed exact replicas of German and Japanese residential structures. They built them to scale using authentic materials. Japanese houses got special attention. Traditional Japanese construction used paper screens, wood frames, and tatami mats, perfect fuel for incendiaries. Test after test, the results were devastating. Napalm penetrated deeper into structures than thermite. It burned longer than magnesium, it spread further than gasoline, and it was cheap. The Harvard development project cost $5.2 million total. Compare that to $27 billion for the Manhattan Project's 2 atomic bombs. Measured purely in development cost per Japanese city destroyed, napalm cost $83,000 per target. Nuclear weapons cost $13.5 billion each. By mid-1942, napalm was in production. Standard Oil Development Company manufactured the thickening powder. Dow Chemical joined production later. The first napalm saw combat in August 1943 when American troops used it in flamethrowers during the invasion of Sicily. They burned a wheat field where German forces were believed hiding. Effective, but unremarkable. The Pacific War was different. The Pacific War was where napalm found its purpose. Japanese defensive doctrine in 1943 rested on a simple foundation: fortify. A century of military tradition emphasized offensive action. Japanese army manuals from 1909 onward focused on attack. The defensive form of combat was distasteful. Admitting the Imperial Army might be forced into defensive fighting contradicted fundamental military philosophy. But by mid-1944, the strategic situation left no alternative. American forces were island-hopping toward the Japanese home islands. Each battle brought them closer. The Philippines, the Marianas. Soon they would reach the Bonin Islands and Ryukyus. The choice was clear: defend or die. Japanese military engineers became extraordinarily skilled at fortification. They studied every battle, learned from every defeat. By 1944, they had developed defensive construction techniques that turned Pacific islands into fortresses. The foundation of Japanese defensive positions was concrete. Reinforced concrete resists both compression and tension forces from high explosives. A concrete bunker 3 feet thick could withstand direct hits from naval gunfire. Only the largest shells, striking at optimal angles, could penetrate. Japanese engineers on islands like Iwo Jima had an advantage. The volcanic ash and cinder covering the island mixed excellently with cement. Some bunkers reached 6 stories deep into the volcanic rock. The cinder also contained magnetite, which interfered with American mine detectors. Japanese forces sowed minefields freely, knowing American engineers couldn't easily locate them. Where natural caves existed, Japanese engineers expanded them. The limestone caves, common throughout Pacific islands, had walls and ceilings made of natural concrete, far thicker than man-made structures. Engineers connected caves with tunnel systems. They created mutually supporting firing positions. They installed steel doors and ventilation shafts. They stockpiled ammunition, food, and medical supplies in underground storage chambers. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, perfected this defensive approach. He recognized that his 11,000 troops couldn't defeat an American invasion, but they could make Americans pay in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. Pre-war Japanese doctrine called for defending beaches, destroying landing forces before they established footholds. Kuribayashi abandoned that strategy. Let the Americans land unopposed. Let them push inland, then strike from concealed positions that naval bombardment hadn't touched. Under Kuribayashi's direction, Japanese engineers worked from March 1944 through February 1945. They created a nightmarish network. Over 11 miles of tunnels connecting over 600 pillboxes and bunkers, artillery emplacements with overlapping fields of fire, machine gun nests covering every approach, fighting positions designed so that destroying one wouldn't silence supporting positions nearby. The density of fortifications on Iwo Jima exceeded anything American forces had encountered. Fifth, Marine Division combat engineers estimated after the battle that they destroyed 5,000 cave entrances and pillboxes, 5,000, on an island 8 square miles in area. This defensive philosophy made perfect sense given Japan's strategic position in 1944. The empire was contracting, resources were dwindling. Trained soldiers couldn't be replaced at the rate combat consumed them, but concrete and time remained available. Build fortifications strong enough to withstand American firepower. Force Americans into close-quarters combat, where numbers and technology meant less than determination. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fortifications served a psychological purpose beyond their tactical value. Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual power over material advantage. The concept of fighting spirit, or seishin, meant proper martial values could overcome superior enemy forces. If material advantage belonged to Americans, then Japanese forces would leverage terrain, fortification, and willingness to die. American military planners studied Japanese defensive improvements with growing concern. Each battle showed Japanese positions becoming harder to reduce. Tarawa, in November 1943, cost over 3,000 American casualties to seize an atoll 2 miles long. The Japanese garrison of 4,700 fought almost to the last man from coconut log bunkers and reinforced concrete positions. Peleliu, in September 1944, was worse. The coral limestone ridges and caves on that island allowed Japanese forces to build positions impervious to preliminary bombardment. The 1st Marine Division suffered 70% casualties in some units. Combat engineers found that flamethrowers were the only reliable method for reducing fortified caves. The problem was that portable flamethrowers were death sentences for operators. The bulky fuel tanks made them obvious targets. Casualty rates for flamethrower troops routinely exceeded 90%. On Iwo Jima, the portable flamethrower units of 1 battalion suffered 92% casualties. You couldn't sustain operations with those losses. American forces needed something different, something that combined the penetrating power of flamethrowers with protection for the operators. The answer came from an unlikely source: Navy Seabees working at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. In May 1944, a composite unit led by Colonel Unmacht of the Army Chemical Warfare Service began modifying light tanks. They removed the main gun from M3 light tanks and installed flame projectors fueled by napalm. The first prototype was christened Hell's Afire. The installation limited turret traverse to 180 degrees, but the range was revolutionary, 40 to 80 yards, 3 times the range of portable flamethrowers. Seabees concluded the Army's initial design was over-engineered and simplified it. Working dawn to dusk, they modified 24 M3 tanks in time for the Saipan and Tinian campaigns. The tanks were designated Satans unofficially. Officially, the Marines called them M4A 3R5. The Japanese called them M1 tanks, possibly due to mistranslating the designation. Production expanded. 54 more tanks received Ronson flamethrowers. These had even longer range. Some were configured with 400-foot external hoses, supplying portable flamethrowers that ground troops could use from behind the tank's armor protection. The flame tanks proved devastatingly effective. At Saipan in June 1944, Marines used them to clear bunker complexes that had resisted days of artillery bombardment. The tanks could approach fortified positions, spray napalm through firing slits, and withdraw while Japanese defenders died inside. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese soldiers feared flame tanks more than any other weapon. But flame tanks were specialized assets. Each Marine tank battalion had only 4. They couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. Most bunker reduction still fell to combat engineers with demolition charges, grenades, and portable flamethrowers. The real transformation came from the air. 2/3 of all napalm bombs produced during World War II were used in the Pacific. The primary weapon was the M69 incendiary, an unpretentious steel pipe with hexagonal cross-section, 3 inches in diameter, 20 inches long, weighing 6 pounds, filled with napalm gel and triggered by a white phosphorus charge. The M69s were dropped in clusters, 38 bomblets per cluster, released at 2,000 feet altitude. Cotton streamers on each bomblet oriented it nose down and armed the fuse. Upon impact, the bomblet waited 3 to 5 seconds. This delay ensured it was lying on its side. Then a white phosphorus charge detonated, explosively projecting burning napalm up to 100 feet horizontally. If unobstructed, the gel could travel 300 feet. A single Boeing B-29 Superfortress could carry 40 cluster bombs. 1,520 M69 bomblets per aircraft. Each bomblet created a fire that burned for 15 to 30 seconds with original napalm, up to 10 minutes with improved Napalm B. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, shifted strategy in early 1945. Precision bombing from high altitude wasn't working. Weather over Japan limited bombing days to a few per month, high winds dispersed bombs, reducing accuracy, and Japan's war production wasn't concentrated in large factories. It was distributed across thousands of small shops throughout cities. LeMay ordered low-altitude incendiary raids. On the night of March 9th through 10th, 1945, 325 B-29s launched from Guam and Saipan. They flew at 5,000 to 7,000 feet and dropped 7-ton bomb loads on Tokyo, Operation Meeting House. The single deadliest air attack in history, 1,600. 65 tons of incendiaries fell on Tokyo's northeast section. The resulting firestorm burned out 15.8 square miles. 79,466 bodies were recovered. Post-war estimates put deaths at 87,793, with 40,918 injured. More than died at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. 40,000 tons of M69s fell on Japan throughout the war. 64 cities damaged or destroyed. The firebombing campaign killed more Japanese civilians than the atomic bombs. But the tactical use of napalm against fortifications was different from strategic bombing of cities. When American forces faced Japanese bunkers, they weren't trying to burn buildings. They were trying to kill soldiers in positions specifically designed to resist conventional explosives. The fortifications that seemed impregnable to artillery and bombs proved horrifyingly vulnerable to napalm, and Japanese commanders had no framework for understanding why. The physics of what happened inside a fortified bunker when napalm entered it were brutally simple, but Japanese military engineers in 1944 didn't understand them. They couldn't. No military in history had faced weapons that combined penetrating fire, extreme temperatures, and atmospheric manipulation all at once. Consider a typical Japanese bunker on Iwo Jima. Concrete walls 3 feet thick, steel-reinforced roof capable of withstanding 500-pound bombs, multiple firing slits providing overlapping fields of fire, ventilation shafts bringing fresh air from the surface, tunnel connections to adjacent positions, allowing defenders to retreat and reinforce. Storage chambers with ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Sleeping areas for the garrison. The engineers who designed these positions calculated for every conventional threat. Artillery shells. They calculated the angle of impact, the explosive force, the penetration depth, rifle fire, obviously ineffective against concrete. Grenades could be thrown through firing slits, but the bunker's internal design included blast walls and corners to contain grenade fragments. Flamethrowers. Dangerous, but the range was limited. A defender could fire on the operator before he got close enough to be effective. What they couldn't calculate was napalm's behavior inside confined spaces. When jellied gasoline burned in an enclosed area, it didn't just produce heat. It initiated a cascade of lethal effects that turned the fortification itself into a weapon against its occupants. First, the temperature. Napalm burned between 1400 and 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside a concrete bunker with limited ventilation, temperatures climbed even higher. The concrete walls reflected heat back into the interior. Metal surfaces like steel reinforcement bars, weapons, ammunition became conducting elements that amplified thermal effects. Within 30 seconds, the interior temperature of a bunker could exceed 2000 degrees. At those temperatures, human survival was impossible. Exposed skin blistered instantly, lungs seared with each breath. But most defenders never experienced burns directly. The atmospheric effects killed them first. Burning napalm consumed oxygen voraciously. In open air, this effect was negligible. Oxygen from surrounding atmosphere continuously replaced what combustion consumed. But inside a sealed or semi-sealed bunker, the oxygen depletion was catastrophic. A fortification designed to protect against explosives became a death trap. Ventilation shafts designed to provide fresh air couldn't move atmosphere fast enough to replace what napalm consumed. Oxygen levels dropped from normal 21% to below 10% in under a minute. At 10% oxygen, humans lose consciousness. At 6%, death follows within minutes. Soldiers in the bunker didn't just suffocate slowly, they lost consciousness rapidly as their brains were starved of oxygen. But oxygen depletion was only part of the equation. Combustion produced byproducts, carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. In proper combustion with sufficient oxygen, napalm primarily produced carbon dioxide. But in oxygen-starved environments, incomplete combustion generated massive quantities of carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide levels inside a burning bunker could exceed 20%. At 4% concentration, carbon monoxide kills within an hour. At 20%, death comes in minutes. The gas is odorless, colorless, tasteless. Victims had no warning. They breathed normally until they didn't. Consciousness faded. Confusion set in. Then collapse. The ventilation shafts that engineers had carefully positioned to provide fresh air became conduits for smoke and toxic gases. Napalm produced thick, acrid black smoke. In confined spaces, the smoke was blinding. It filled lungs, triggered coughing, induced panic. Soldiers couldn't see to fight, couldn't breathe to function, couldn't escape through tunnels already filled with smoke from adjacent bunkers under simultaneous attack. Some Japanese defensive positions had multiple levels, command bunkers reaching 6 stories deep into volcanic rock. These deep positions seemed invulnerable. But napalm followed gravity. Burning gel dripped through ventilation shafts. It flowed down stairways and tunnel ramps. It penetrated to the deepest levels, carrying fire, heat, and toxic gases with it. The defenders had no effective countermeasure. Water. Napalm was designed specifically to resist water. The jellied gasoline floated on water and continued burning. Some Japanese soldiers tried to smother flames with sand or dirt. This sometimes worked on small quantities, but when flame tanks or aerial bombs delivered napalm by the gallon, smothering was impossible. Retreat through tunnels seemed logical, but tunnel networks, designed for tactical flexibility, became death traps. Smoke and gases flowed through the tunnels faster than soldiers could run. Men who fled from bunkers under attack often died in tunnels, overcome by carbon monoxide poisoning before reaching safer positions. The Marine Corps observed these effects during the Battle of Saipan in June 1944. Flame tanks assaulted Japanese positions in the island's mountainous interior. After napalm attacks, Marines would wait 30 minutes before attempting to enter bunkers. Even then, they frequently found all defenders dead with no signs of burns. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The men had simply gone to sleep and never woken. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, this pattern repeated on a massive scale. The island's volcanic terrain was ideal for Japanese defensive construction. General Kuribayashi's forces had built perhaps the most sophisticated fortification network in the Pacific. 11 miles of tunnels, 600 major defensive positions, hundreds of smaller fighting holes, all designed to survive conventional bombardment. The preliminary naval bombardment of Iwo Jima lasted 3 days. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired thousands of shells. Carrier aircraft dropped conventional bombs. The Japanese positions, as predicted, survived largely intact. When Marines landed on February 19th, they faced the full force of Kuribayashi's defense in depth. The flame tanks landed on D-Day but went into action sparingly on D+2. Marine commanders were cautious with the specialized assets, but as casualties mounted from assaulting fortified positions with conventional weapons, flame tank requests increased exponentially. Marines became dependent on them. Units would hold up assaults until flame tanks arrived. Since each tank battalion had only 4 flame tanks, they were pooled between units. The tanks would refuel at central locations, then dispatch to wherever fighting was heaviest. Toward the end of the battle, 5th Marine Division tanks expended between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons of napalm per day. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Veterans of Iwo Jima later described the sound of approaching flame tanks as inducing pure terror, the distinctive engine noise, the squeal of treads on volcanic rock, the knowledge of what was coming. Soldiers who had faced artillery barrages and aerial bombing with disciplined calm reported breaking down when flame tanks appeared. Japanese after-action reports from Pacific battles in late 1944 and early 1945 showed increasing recognition of napalm's effectiveness. Intelligence officers compiled incident reports. Commanders circulated tactical bulletins. But changing defensive construction doctrine required time and resources Japan no longer possessed. Some commanders ordered modifications to existing fortifications, seal ventilation shafts that could channel napalm, create emergency escape routes not connected to main tunnel, networks, install blast doors that could contain fire. But these modifications were difficult to implement on islands already under siege. Iwo Jima's defenders had spent 10 months building their fortifications. They couldn't rebuild them in the weeks before American invasion. The strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. American planners preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan's home islands, factored napalm heavily into their calculations. Intelligence estimates suggested Japan had fortified every beach, every mountain, every city block where Americans might land. Millions of soldiers and armed civilians prepared to resist. Napalm offered a terrible solution. Flame tanks could clear fortified positions. Aerial incendiaries could burn cities. The weapon that had proven so effective in the Pacific could be scaled up for the ultimate invasion. Production of napalm and delivery systems accelerated through the summer of 1945, but the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August rendered Operation Downfall unnecessary. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war was over. The aftermath of napalm's use in the Pacific War raised questions that persist to this day. Was it necessary? Was it proportional? Was it humane? From a purely military perspective, napalm solved a specific tactical problem. Japanese fortifications were extraordinarily resistant to conventional weapons. Reducing them with artillery and direct assault cost American lives at unsustainable rates. Flame weapons, and particularly napalm-based systems, reduced those fortifications at much lower cost to attackers. The numbers support this assessment. On Iwo Jima, conventional assaults on fortified positions resulted in casualty rates exceeding 50% for attacking units. When flame tanks were available, casualty rates for the same types of objectives dropped to 15 to 20%. The weapon saved American lives in the context of battles that were happening regardless. But the use against civilian targets raised different questions. The firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities using M69 napalm incendiaries killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Children, elderly, non-combatants with no connection to military operations. The moral calculus of those attacks remains debated. Louis Fieser, napalm's inventor, maintained throughout his life that he created the weapon for use against structures, not people. In a 1967 interview, he stated, "I couldn't foresee that this stuff was going to be used against babies and Buddhists." He compared his role to that of a rifle manufacturer who isn't responsible if the rifle is used to shoot someone. But this comparison overlooks the specific design choices built into napalm. The jellied gasoline was formulated specifically to stick to surfaces, including human skin. The burning characteristics were optimized for maximum temperature and duration. The tests at Dugway Proving Ground explicitly targeted mock-ups of Japanese houses, not industrial facilities. Fieser later acknowledged some regret. In June 1972, reading about a napalm accident in Vietnam that killed 20 civilians and soldiers, he wrote to President Richard Nixon, suggesting an international agreement to outlaw napalm use. Nixon's science advisor replied that napalm's use was difficult to predict or control, but offered bland assurance the suggestion would receive careful attention. The weapon FISA created continued, used long after World War II. In Korea, United Nations forces dropped twice as much napalm as fell on Japan during World War II. In Vietnam, 388,000 tons fell between 1963 and 1973, 10 times Korea, 20 times World War II Pacific usage. The imagery from Vietnam, particularly the Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of 9-year-old Kim Phuc running naked from a napalm attack, transformed the weapon from tactical tool to symbol of war's cruelty. Protests against Dow Chemical, napalm's largest manufacturer, became centerpieces of anti-war movements. In 1980, the United Nations adopted Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. Incendiary attacks against concentrations of civilians became war crimes under international law. Most American allies and adversaries ratified the protocol relatively quickly. The United States initially refused, but eventually signed with reservations. For Japanese forces in the Pacific War, napalm represented something specific beyond the general horror of modern warfare. It invalidated defensive doctrine they had developed through years of experience. The elaborate fortifications that should have made American advances prohibitively costly became crematoriums for defenders. The spiritual power and martial determination that Japanese military culture emphasized couldn't overcome atmospheric physics and combustion chemistry. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi never learned how completely napalm dominated the battle for Iwo Jima. He died in the final days of fighting, probably during a last-ditch counterattack in late March 1945. His body was never found, but reports from survivors indicated that toward the end, Japanese defenders increasingly refused to enter fortified positions. They preferred dying in open combat to being trapped in bunkers when flame tanks arrived. This represented a fundamental psychological shift. Japanese military doctrine emphasized holding positions to the death. Abandoning fortifications was considered shameful. But by March 1945 on Iwo Jima, survival instinct overcame doctrine. Soldiers recognized that concrete bunkers weren't protection, they were tombs. The broader impact on military engineering and doctrine was significant. Post-war fortress design incorporated lessons from Pacific island battles. Modern bunkers include sealed environmental systems, multiple redundant ventilation paths, and fire suppression systems specifically designed to counter incendiary weapons. The assumption that thick concrete walls provide safety has been replaced with understanding that fortifications must account for atmospheric weapons. The development of thermobaric weapons in the Cold War followed directly from napalm's demonstrated effectiveness. Thermobaric devices use similar principles. Fuel-air mixture, oxygen depletion, overpressure effects. They're even more effective against fortified positions than napalm because the fuel disperses as a cloud before ignition, penetrating deeper into tunnel networks and sealed spaces. The specific tactical employment of napalm in the Pacific War also influenced Cold War doctrine. Soviet military planners studied American flame tank operations extensively. They developed their own flamethrower tank designs and incorporated them into armored formations. The understanding that fortifications could be reduced by thermal and atmospheric attack rather than just kinetic energy became fundamental to modern warfare. For the engineers and soldiers who designed and defended Japanese positions in the Pacific, there was a cruel irony. They had learned from early war defeats, adapted their tactics, built fortifications that conventional weapons couldn't easily reduce, done everything military doctrine suggested for defensive warfare, and they discovered too late that the rules had changed. Napalm didn't just defeat their fortifications. It made the fortifications themselves complicit in killing defenders. The enclosed spaces that should have provided protection concentrated heat, smoke, and toxic gases. The ventilation systems that should have maintained habitability became distribution networks for death. The tunnel networks that should have enabled tactical flexibility became catacombs. The weapon killed with precision in its imprecision. You didn't need to aim napalm accurately. The burning gel flowed into openings, dripped into lower levels, penetrated wherever air could go. A near miss with napalm was often as lethal as a direct hit. Japanese soldiers facing napalm attacks had no heroic death available. Traditional Japanese military culture emphasized dying honorably in combat. But there was nothing honorable about suffocating in darkness from carbon monoxide poisoning. Nothing glorious about being baked alive in concrete ovens of your own construction. The men who died in those bunkers weren't cowards. They were soldiers following orders, defending positions as their training and culture demanded. They simply faced a weapon their doctrine couldn't counter and their engineering couldn't defeat. The final toll of napalm's use in the Pacific remains difficult to calculate precisely. Tens of thousands died in tactical use against fortifications, hundreds of thousands in strategic bombing of cities. The weapon that Louis Fisa developed in a Harvard basement shaped the Pacific War's final year as significantly as any other technology except the atomic bomb. And unlike the atomic bomb, which was used twice and never again in warfare, napalm remained in military arsenals for decades. The tactical lessons learned burning defenders from concrete bunkers on Pacific islands were applied in Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts throughout the world. When the last smoke cleared over Iwo Jima on March 26, 1945, American forces had paid a terrible price. 6,821 Marines killed, 19,217 wounded, the bloodiest Marine Corps battle in history measured by casualties per day of combat. But Japanese casualties were worse. Of the 21,000 defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died, many in fortifications that became their tombs. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima called flame tanks, the best weapon they had for taking the island. After Okinawa, in June 1945, Army commanders reported that flame tanks had a psychological presence on the battlefield beyond their tactical effect. American troops preferred following flame tanks over standard armor because of the fear they inspired in enemy forces. That fear was rational. Japanese soldiers had learned through bitter experience that concrete fortifications offered no safety against napalm. The defensive doctrine that seemed sound in 1944 had been invalidated by a weapon their military engineers never anticipated. They had prepared for conventional siege warfare. Instead, they faced chemical warfare that turned their own defenses against them. The lesson extended beyond the Pacific War. Military forces worldwide recognized that fortification design required accounting for atmospheric weapons. That defensive positions needed environmental protection as sophisticated as their ballistic protection. That concrete alone wouldn't save you. Louis Fisa died in 1977 at age 78. His obituary mentioned his contributions to chemistry, his work on vitamin K synthesis, his educational innovations. Napalm rated a single paragraph. The weapon that defined his legacy was something he spent decades trying to reconcile with his conscience. In his later years, Fisa maintained that military applications of science were inevitable. If he hadn't invented napalm, someone else would have. The chemical principles were straightforward. The military need was obvious. Better that it came from American scientists working to defeat fascism than emerging somewhere else. But this rationalization ignored the specific design choices that made napalm particularly cruel. The stickiness that made it cling to human skin, the burning duration that maximized tissue damage, the smoke production that induced suffocation even beyond the fire's reach. These weren't inevitable, outcomes of basic chemistry. They were engineered features. The Japanese commanders, who never expected napalm bombs to create 2,000-degree firestorms across bunkers, weren't fools. They were experienced military engineers working with the best information available. They designed fortifications that would have been nearly impregnable against 1942 technology. Their error was assuming that defensive construction could keep pace with offensive innovation. It couldn't. It never can. The siege warfare paradigm that dominated military thinking for centuries couldn't survive the 20th century's chemical and physical innovations. Napalm was just one weapon in that transformation. But it was the weapon that most clearly demonstrated how quickly defensive assumptions could become obsolete. The story of napalm in the Pacific War is ultimately about the collision between military tradition and scientific innovation. Japanese forces built fortifications based on centuries of military engineering principles. American forces countered with a weapon invented in a university laboratory just 3 years before deployment. The fortifications were magnificent. The weapon was devastating. The result was never in doubt once napalm reached the battlefield in quantity. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.